Today marks the day racism officially ended in South Africa. With the signing of the new interim constitution, South Africa had taken the first step towards a new era for the country, an era that will be based on unity and not division, an era of peace and prosperity and not violence, an era that would look to end and compensate for all the wrongdoings the previous government had done just because their skin color was white. Hello folks, today on Behind the Date, we will take you back to the time of Apartheid, a time when South Africa was the most racist country in the world, where laws favored the whites even though they were the minorities. So how did it begin? How did the black community fight against it? What role did Nelson Mandela play in the freedom struggle? Find answers to all these and more right now. South Africa's colonial history is a complex and often painful one, stretching back centuries. It began when Europeans first arrived in the region in the 17th century, bringing with them ideas of European imperialism and a desire for economic and political gain. Over the centuries, successive colonial powers sought to gain control of the resources and labor of the region, resulting in a long period of conflict and oppression. During the colonial period, South Africa was divided into several distinct racial and ethnic divisions. The white minority, which included both the Dutch and British settlers, held the majority of political and economic power. This led to the policy of apartheid, which was introduced in 1948. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and oppression that lasted more than 40 years. It was based on the idea of racial separateness and superiority of the white population. This system of segregation meant that all non-white South Africans were excluded from politically, economically, and socially participating in the country. Non-white South Africans were denied basic rights such as voting, owning property, and traveling freely. They were also forced to carry identification cards and were prohibited from living in certain areas. The laws of apartheid were enforced by the government through the use of violent police raids, torture, and imprisonment. This violent system of oppression was particularly prominent in the townships of South Africa, where many non-white South Africans lived in poverty and faced immense discrimination. In the late 1940s, a movement of resistance began to emerge, with the African National Congress, ANC, leading the campaign against apartheid. The ANC called for an end to racial discrimination and economic exploitation, and a more equitable distribution of resources. One of the key figures who represented the ANC at the time was Nelson Mandela. Mandela's fight against apartheid was one of the most important struggles for human rights of the 20th century. He joined the African National Congress in 1843 and soon became its leader. He organized strikes, boycotts, and other forms of peaceful protest against the oppressive apartheid laws. He was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to life in prison for his anti-apartheid activities. He spent more than 27 years in prison. Mandela was released from prison in 1990 and continued to fight for an end to apartheid. He struck a deal with the leader of the white minority government, and the two leaders negotiated a peaceful transition to a multi-racial democracy. In 1994, Mandela was elected president of South Africa in the country's first free and fair elections. But before Mandela could become the president, certain changes had to be made in the constitution, make it more equal. The Interim Constitution of South Africa, adopted in 1994, served as the basis of government for the country until the adoption of the current Constitution of South Africa in 1996. The Constitution was adopted following the end of apartheid in South Africa and was a result of negotiations between the African National Congress, the National Party, and other political parties. It contained several fundamental rights and freedoms, including the right to vote, the right to freedom of speech and expression, and the right to equal protection before the law. The interim constitution was intended to be a stepping stone towards a fully democratic South Africa. It provided a framework for the adoption of a new constitution that would be more reflective of the multicultural and multi-ethnic society of South Africa. With the adoption of the new constitution, South Africa was heading towards being a progressive democracy in the world. The only they needed was a fair and just election, and that's what happened. In 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic elections that allowed all South Africans, regardless of their race, to vote. The election marked the end of the decades-long apartheid regime, which had denied black South Africans their basic rights. The election was a historic moment for South Africa and the world as a whole, as it signified a significant step forward for human rights and democracy in the country. The election was contested by four major political parties: the African National Congress, ANC, the National Party, NP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, and the Democratic Party, DP. The ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, campaigned on a platform of racial equality and economic justice. The NP, led by F.W. de Klerk, campaigned on a platform of white minority rights and conservative economic policies. The IFP, led by Mangosuthu Buthelezi, campaigned on a platform of Zulu cultural rights and federalism. The DP, led by Zach de Beer, campaigned on a platform of liberal economics and greater rights for non-black minorities. As expected, the ANC emerged as the clear winner, making the election of 1994 a watershed moment in South African history. The ANC's victory signaled the end of the apartheid regime and the beginning of a more equitable and inclusive society. The election also pushed South Africa towards a more open and representative democracy, as it allowed for the peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another. The election also provided an opportunity for South Africans to come together as a nation and begin to heal the wounds of the past. Mandela became the first black president in South Africa's history. As president, Mandela sought to heal the racial divisions in the country and bring about reconciliation between its different ethnic and racial groups. He also worked towards creating a better economic and social environment for all South Africans, regardless of race or class. In addition, Mandela worked to improve the economy of South Africa. He implemented a variety of programs and policies aimed at increasing economic growth and reducing poverty. He also made sure that the government was effectively managing its resources and that all citizens had access to basic services such as education and healthcare. Mandela also worked to improve the quality of life for all South Africans. He made sure that the country had access to clean water and electricity, and that all citizens had access to basic amenities such as education and healthcare. He also worked to create job opportunities for the country's citizens and to reduce unemployment. Overall, Nelson Mandela's work as president of South Africa was instrumental in helping the country move towards an era of democracy. He worked to ensure equality for all South Africans, regardless of race or class, and to create a better economic and social environment for all its citizens. His commitment to justice and equality made him an iconic figure in the fight against apartheid, and his legacy is still celebrated today. Also, can you guess which other country also had to fight against British rule for their independence and involves a short man who becomes the symbol of the freedom struggle? If you guessed India, you are right. Check out our previous video on India's freedom struggle, and boy, what is it dramatic.